Alright, let's get started. Welcome to Yuki's Coffee University. Today, I'll be talking about espresso routines. Now, why did I pick this topic? I've worked as a coffee trainer for a long time and have taught hundreds of people. And through all of that, something I've always felt strongly about is making sure I share the right information in the right way. When you're learning face-to-face, sometimes it's hard to ask questions. You might want to ask, but the timing doesn't feel right. So you hesitate, and then before you know it, the moment's gone. You end up leaving without really understanding something important. That's why I wanted to make a video like this. You can watch it whenever you want, go back and review, and learn at your own pace. That helps you understand the process more clearly and also makes it easier to apply what you've learned during your work. So let's go through it together. I'm excited to share this with you. To start off, I want to talk about why espresso is actually so difficult. A question I hear a lot is, what's the difference between espresso and pour-over? In my opinion, espresso is difficult because it requires precision at every step. Pour-over is hard for a different reason. It gives you a lot of choices, and figuring out what works best can be a challenge. Espresso is very sensitive. Each movement you make affects the outcome, and everything has to be done right to get a good result. That's what makes it tricky. It demands consistency and attention to detail. On the other hand, pour-over gives you freedom to adjust many things like grind size, water temperature, how you pour, where you pour, how high you pour from, whether or not you rinse the filter, and even the shape of the dripper. With pour-over, you have to choose the best method for that specific coffee and situation. That flexibility is what makes it tough in its own way. Espresso machines take care of things like pressure and temperature, so that part is usually stable. But the prep work before the extraction needs to be super solid. If you are even a little sloppy with the process, the espresso can come out too bitter or just not enjoyable. A lot of people think espresso is just bitter and hard to drink, but when it's made the right way, it's absolutely delicious. You get all the good parts of coffee packed into a small, beautiful shot. So today, we'll go through the important points that will help you make that kind of espresso. Let's jump in. When it comes to making espresso, one of the first things you need to think about is the recipe. Usually, it's made up of three main parts: how much coffee you use, how much liquid you get out, and how long it takes to brew. Most cafes should already have a set recipe for the espresso. But if there's no recipe, that probably means they're just making it based on feel. And when you do that, the flavor can change a lot from shot to shot. That's why having a recipe really helps keep things consistent. From my own experience, even a tiny difference like 0.2 grams can totally change how the espresso tastes. To give you an idea, 0.2 grams is like 1 or 2 drops of espresso liquid. It doesn't sound like much, but those few drops can really affect the quality of the shot. So if you're just eyeballing it and stopping the shot when it looks about right, you're probably not going to get consistent results. It might taste okay one time and totally different the next. Now, to brew espresso, you need a machine called a grinder. This machine grinds coffee beans into really fine particles, and that's what allows us to make a strong, rich espresso in a short amount of time. A question I get a lot is, how fine should the grind be? I usually say, think of something like the sand you'd find in a playground. You know that soft, smooth sand that runs through your fingers. when you scoop it up, that's the kind of texture we're going for. Alright, from here we're gonna go through the steps of making espresso in detail. First, let's start with the machine. The very first thing you need to do is take out the portafilter. That's what this part is called. Once it's out, the next step is something called flushing. What that means is the shower screen on the machine might still have some leftover coffee particles from the last shot. So we flush it with hot water to clean that off. Doing this helps make sure the next espresso you pour tastes clean and fresh. So once you've removed the portafilter, be sure to give the machine a quick rinse before moving on. After that, wipe the basket of the portafilter. Now you might wonder why you need to wipe it. Well, right after you remove it from the machine, there's usually still some hot water inside the basket. If you douse your coffee into a wet basket, the grounds can stick together, and that messes with the consistency of your extraction. That's why it's really important to wipe the basket thoroughly with a dry cloth. Taking a moment to do that can make a big difference in the quality of your espresso. And here's an important tip. Make sure to wipe not just the inside of the basket, but the outside too. Most people only wipe the inside and think that's enough, but the outside actually matters a lot as well. The basket is made of metal and has lots of tiny holes. Even if the inside is dry, if there's a moisture left on the outside, that water can creep into the coffee grounds through surface tension. When that happens, it messes with your distribution and tamping. You can end up with little gaps in the puck, and that causes channeling during extraction. And once you get channeling, the espresso won't extract evenly and the flavor drops. That's why wiping both the inside and outside of the basket is super important. So yeah, I know just talking about it might be a bit hard to picture, so let me actually show you what I mean. Right now, both the inside and outside of the basket are wet. I'm gonna try wiping just the inside and leave the outside as is, then douse the coffee. As you can see, some of the grounds stick to the basket. When I try to do distribution like this, the coffee bed doesn't really settle evenly. The part that was sticking tends to leave gaps around it, and that leads to things like channeling or uneven extraction, which, of course, ends up affecting the flavor in a bad way. That's why it's super important to wipe both the inside and the outside of the basket properly. That said, I know some portafilters are just harder to clean. For example, with double spout types, it's pretty tricky to wipe the inside properly. But just knowing this kind of detail changes how much care you put into each step. So I really want you to keep it in mind. Actually, when I first started working at this cafe, all the portafilters were double spout, but I wanted to see the extraction clearly and clean the basket properly inside and out, because I knew that would help improve the espresso. So I asked to switch to bottomless portafilters. Alright, let's keep going. To make espresso accurately based on the recipe, you need a scale. First, use the scale and press start to reset it to 0. Each portafilter actually has a slightly different weight, so if you don't zero it out every time, your coffee dose might be off. Once it's set to 0, place the portafilter in the grinder and grind your coffee. Then check the weight again. Depending on the grinder, sometimes it gives you the exact amount you need, but other times it can be a little under or over. If it's under, just add a bit more using a spoon. By the way, today's recipe is 18 grams, so we're aiming for that. Now here's a little tip. I recommend using a spoon to adjust the dose. Some people try to fix the amount by pinching the grounds with their fingers like this, but honestly, I wouldn't recommend doing that. Coffee grounds have oils on them, and our fingers do too. So when you touch the grounds with your fingers, you can end up compacting the surface. And when you do distribution after that, those crumbs don't break apart easily and it messes with the evenness. That's why it's better to use a small spoon for adjustments. A big spoon makes it harder to control the amount and takes more time. Something small and easy to handle works best. That way, the whole process becomes quicker and smoother. Today's recipe is 18 grams. Personally, I think if it's off by about 0.1 grams, that's still fine. Technically, if you change the dose, you're also supposed to adjust the yield and the time, otherwise it throws off the flavor balance. But when it comes to milk-based drinks, that small difference of 0.1 grams isn't really noticeable. With straight espresso, yeah, you'll probably taste the difference. But with drinks like lattes or cappuccinos, it's not that sensitive. So I'd say if you're serving espresso on its own, stick closely to the recipe. But if you're making a milk-based drink, being off by just a little bit is probably okay. Of course, it's always better to be as accurate as you can, but in a busy cafe setting, sometimes you have to find the right balance. Alright? We just measured the dose, so now we're moving on to the next step, which is distribution. Some cafes use tools like the OCD or NCD for this step. Which one they use depends on the shop, so make sure you check what they use at your place. So what does this tool actually do? Basically, it helps level out the coffee grounds evenly. Here's how it works. You place the tool on top of the portafilter and spin it a few times. After that, when you take it off, you'll see the surface is nice and flat. Next, we move on to tamping. But before that, there's one thing I want you to be careful about. A distribution tool is really helpful when you're prepping espresso, but I wouldn't say it's perfect. I see it more as a support tool, not something you should rely on completely. For example, there's this tool called the OCD. I'm sure a lot of you have seen or used it before. What it mainly does is level the surface of the coffee bed. It doesn't really take care of the distribution deeper inside the puck. To get that evenness throughout, you still need to use your hands and do some manual work. By the way, this OCD tool actually lets you adjust the depth. I'm not adjusting it today because mine's a little stiff right now. But yeah, you can make it go deeper or shallower. Now, why would you set it shallow? Well, if you set it too deep, it ends up compressing the grounds while it's spinning. That can shift the coffee inside and throw off your shot. But when you keep it shallow, it just lightly smooths the top layer. That's why I recommend doing some hand distribution first to make sure the inside is already nice and even. Then the tool can just help tidy up the surface at the end. There are a few ways to do hand distribution. One is tapping the portafilter gently on the counter to level it out. Some people also tap it lightly from different angles. These motions help even out the grounds not just on the surface but inside too. Once you've done that, using the OCD tool to clean up the top makes a lot more sense. Alright, let's move on to tamping. There are two main ways to tamp. One is manual tamping, where the barista presses down with their hand. The other is using an automatic tamper. For example, with this machine here, you just place the portafilter in and it goes clunk clunk, and the tamping's done for you. Super handy. It also helps protect the barista's wrist. When you're pulling hundreds of shots a day, constantly tamping by hand can actually mess up your wrist. I've been there. When I first started as a barista, I was working in this crazy busy cafe and doing all the tamping manually. I ended up hurting my wrist. But now, thanks to tech like the Puqpress, we've got tools that help anyone tamp consistently without injury. You might be wondering which one is better. For me personally, I still prefer hand tamping. There's just something about the control and feel that I like. So why do I recommend hand tamping? It actually has to do with the size of the basket. The one I usually go with is from a brand called VST, and their basket is about 58.5 millimeters. The Puqpress, the one I talked about earlier, is around 58.3 millimeters. That means it's just a little smaller. The reason it's made smaller is because if it matched the basket exactly, it might get stuck when you tamp. But because it's a bit smaller, that outer edge of the coffee bed, like the last little bit, doesn't get tamped properly. So the part that's pressed and the part that isn't can extract differently, and that causes inconsistency. When you tamp by hand, you can apply pressure more evenly all the way across. That's why I feel like hand tamping brings out more flavor and gives you a better shot. Also, the shape of the tamper matters too. I recommend one that's totally flat with sharp edges. That way, it can press all the way to the sides of the basket. If you're making espresso just by yourself and want it to taste great every time, hand tamping is probably the way to go. But if you're working in a place with lots of different people making drinks, the situation changes a bit. For example, a bigger or taller person might tamp harder than someone else. Even if you're using the same grind size, the shot speed can change depending on how much pressure someone applies. So, if you want everyone's shots to come out the same, a machine like the Puqpress can really help. Now, let's talk about using the OCD tool for distribution. One tip here is to keep the number of spins the same every time. Spinning it once and spinning it 3 times will level the grounds differently. That small difference can actually affect how stable your extraction is. So it helps to decide on a routine for yourself, like maybe you always spin it twice. That kind of consistency makes it easier to get a steady and good tasting shot. Alright, let's go over how to use the Puqpress. Just like with a regular tamper, it's a good idea to wipe the metal surface before or after using it. You can just brush it off with your fingers or use a cloth. Either one works fine. The reason is, after tamping, there's usually a bit of coffee ground left on the metal part. If you leave it there, it starts to build up. Eventually, that buildup makes the tamper sit a little higher. When that happens, you might notice the middle of the coffee puck sinks a bit after tamping. That can lead to uneven extraction. So it's a good habit to give it a quick clean every time. Personally, I like wiping it before I use it, just to make sure everything's clean and ready. When you're actually using the Puqpress, there's a sensor inside that kicks in once you set the portafilter in place. The tamping starts on its own. One thing you really want to be careful about here is keeping your hand on the portafilter. If you let go, the machine might shake it a little, and that can lead to a tilted tamp. That kind of thing causes uneven shots, so it's really important to support the portafilter while the tamp is happening. That small step can make a big difference in keeping your tamping consistent. Alright, now let's talk about hand tamping. First, let's look at how you hold the tamper. This part actually matters a lot. You need to hold it in a way that lets you apply solid pressure. For me, I try to place my hand where I could almost do a push-up on top of the tamper. That spot where your arm can push straight down with strength, that's the one you want to find. Your hand has bones running through it, and there's always a place where force naturally comes through best. For me, it's right around here, so I make sure that part lines up with the top of the tamper. Of course, everyone's hands are different sizes. Some people might feel like the tamper is too big or too small. But if you figure out where your strongest spot is and adjust your grip around that, the size won't feel like such a big deal. Once you get that down, tamping feels more stable and controlled. Another thing people often mention is that your elbow should be at a 90-degree angle when you tamp. That's supposed to help you apply straight pressure. But honestly, I don't think it has to be 90 degrees, as long as you're pressing with the same strength every time. What really matters is remembering the distance between your body and the tamper. If that changes each time, the pressure you apply will also change, and that affects the consistency of your shots. Like if you're tamping too close to your body, or reaching too far, or coming in from an angle, your tamp is going to be unstable. So the key is to find a position and a posture that feels comfortable and easy to repeat. Now, why is the way you hold the tamper so important? Because if you're holding it the wrong way and tamping hundreds of shots like that, you can seriously mess up your wrist. That's why you need to hold the tamper in a position where your body can apply pressure naturally and safely. It helps you tamp more consistently, and it protects your body too. In the end, it's good for both your health and the quality of your coffee. Now, I want to talk a bit about finger placement. When I tamp, I always try to line my fingers up with the portafilter. What I mean is, I place my thumb on the front part of the portafilter, and then rest my index finger on the opposite side. I use those two fingers to keep everything balanced while I press down. The actual pressure is coming from the center of my palm, but I use my fingers to feel the balance and my body to sense how much pressure I'm applying. I usually start by placing the tamper gently on top of the coffee, then press down slowly by shifting my body weight. It's not about forcing it with your arm. It's more like letting the weight of your upper body do the work naturally. And once you finish tamping, you lift the tamper off gently. By the way, if you've done everything right leading up to this point, you'll actually feel a slight suction during the tamp. The kind of pull tells you things are nice and even. But if something's uneven inside, you can actually feel that too while you're pressing down. It's like your hand notices the density isn't quite right. Honestly, at that moment, you can already tell whether the espresso is going to turn out good or not. It's kind of like this. If you place the tamper on an uneven table, you'd immediately feel that it's tilted, right? Same thing with coffee. After enough practice, you start to sense when the bed isn't level. And if you ever feel like something's really off, like it's clearly uneven, it's totally fine to stop and do it over. Why don't I tamp directly on a tamping mat? That's a really good question. There's actually a solid reason for it. Personally, I avoid tamping on the mat. Here's why. So you know how the basket and the portafilter are two separate parts, right? And like we talked about earlier, after you take the portafilter out of the machine, you usually rinse it with hot water. Even if you wipe both the inside and the outside really well, there can still be a bit of water left in the seam where the basket and the portafilter connect. Now, if you go and place that straight onto the tamping mat, the leftover water can drip down onto the mat. And most of the time, your tamper or distribution tool is sitting on that same mat, right? So if the mat is damp, your tamper can pick up moisture too. Then that moisture gets transferred to the coffee grounds, and suddenly you've got part of your puck wet and part of it dry. That leads to uneven extraction. To avoid that, I just don't tamp on the mat. Of course, tamping mats are stable and easy to work on, I get that. But for me, it's not worth the risk of adding moisture to the puck, so I prefer to tamp somewhere else. That said, if your setup separates the tamping area from where you place the tamper, that's totally fine. Like if your tamper sits off to the side or on a dedicated stand, that works. As long as the tamper and the puck aren't picking up any moisture from the surface, I'm good with it. That's really the key point here. Keeping anything that touches the coffee free from water. Alright? From here, we're gonna start actually pulling the espresso. Some people like to do one more flush of the shower screen before putting in the portafilter. But for me, if you've already flushed once right after taking the portafilter out, I think that's enough, especially when you're working in a busy cafe. Even waiting for those few extra drips feels like a waste of time. You want to keep things moving smoothly. After that, I usually give the drip tray a quick wipe and then go ahead and set the portafilter. Now, this is something I see a lot. When people are in a rush, they just slam the portafilter into the group head. But that's not a good idea. Sometimes there's still a little bit of water left on the shower screen. If you hit it in too hard, that water can drop down and hit the coffee grounds. When that happens, some of the coffee gets wet before extraction even starts, and that can make the flavor come out uneven. And if you slam it in too hard, the puck inside can shift or even lift a little, which can create gaps between the coffee and the basket. That's one of the things that causes channeling, so the best thing to do is just insert it gently and smoothly. That small step really helps keep everything consistent. Alright, this next part is super important. Once you lock in the portafilter, you need to start the shot right away. Ideally within 1 second. Why? The area around the shower screen is always hot and humid. So if you leave the coffee puck sitting there for too long, even just a few seconds, it starts soaking up that moisture. That can mess with your extraction and make it really uneven. A common example is this. You set the portafilter, then go, which cup should I use? And by the time you pick 1, 10 or 20 seconds have passed. Then you hit the button, but the coffee's already absorbed moisture and the flavor is all over the place. So yeah, what really matters is this. As soon as the portafilter is in place, start the shot right away. This might sound like a small detail, but honestly, it's the little things like this that make a huge difference in the final taste. It's that whole idea of how the magic is in the details. So it's really important to do every step with care and consistency. When you're inserting the portafilter, do it gently. And then start the extraction right after. And if you're using a bottomless portafilter, try taking a peek from underneath while it's extracting. You can check if the espresso is flowing right from the center and how the stream looks. If there's channeling, you'll probably see some coffee spraying out suddenly from the side, and that's a clear sign something's off. You've probably heard people say you can judge espresso by its color, right? But honestly, I don't think it's something you need to worry about too much. On the internet, you'll see stuff like, this is the ideal espresso color, or this color means it's over-extracted, and this one's under-extracted. But honestly, I'd say forget all that. Why? Because the color totally changes depending on the kind of coffee beans you're using. For example, if you're using a darker roast, even when it tastes perfect, the espresso is still gonna look pretty dark. That doesn't mean it's over-extracted. On the flip side, if you're using a light roast, even when it's dialed in really well, it might still look a bit brighter than what people call ideal. So yeah, just judging by color can be misleading. What really matters is using an espresso you already know tastes good. Once you have that, you can start noticing how the color changes when it's tasting right. Alright, let's take a look at what to do right after pouring a shot of espresso. First, you take out the portafilter and always make sure to knock out the used coffee puck. Now, here's something important. Try to do it gently. Sometimes people really slam it hard, like bang, but that loud noise kind of ruins the atmosphere in the cafe. Customers might even look over like, what was that? So it's better to do it quietly, just a light tap to get it out with minimal noise. Another thing to check is the texture of the puck when you knock it out. If it collapses into a wet mess without holding its shape, your grind might be too fine. In that case, you'll probably want to tweak your grind size or adjust your recipe a bit. Ideally, you want the puck to come out looking kind of like a brownie, holding its shape nicely. Also, some cafes just leave the used puck sitting in the portafilter after the shot, but I don't recommend that. The portafilter is still hot and humid after brewing, so if you leave the coffee in there, oils start to leak out and make things messy. If you let it sit like that, it can mess up your next shot. You'll have to clean everything properly before pouring another one, and that just slows things down. So once the shot's done, clean it out right away. That one habit really makes a difference. Alright, so the next important thing is to always make sure the basket is clean. I know some people wonder, should we rinse it every time or not? For me, I rinse it every single time. The thing is, the basket's made of metal, and coffee oils and fine coffee grounds can easily get stuck in there. Especially when you're using a bottomless portafilter, you can see that build up clearly, but with a spouted one, you can't see inside, so you might not realize just how dirty it's gotten until it's too late. And the dirt actually affects the taste a lot. If you don't clean the basket every time, the holes can get clogged, and the extraction speed starts to slow down. It's like your pores getting clogged. If you keep making shots without rinsing the basket, shot after shot, the holes get more blocked, and you'll notice the bitterness increases and the texture gets worse. At that point, a lot of baristas might try adjusting the grind coarseness to fix the extraction speed. But here's the issue. Let's say after a busy rush, you clean the machine and the basket. Now, all the coffee grounds that were stuck in there fall out and the holes open back up. If you try to brew with the same grind size as before, the extraction will be too fast and it'll throw off the balance. But if you clean the basket every time, you avoid that sudden change. So you don't have to constantly adjust your grind size, and the flavor stays more consistent. It also reduces waste and the need to remake coffee. That's why I always clean the basket every time. It's super important. So now I'm gonna show you how fast I usually go through the whole routine. Gotcha. でこの間にトレーとか拭いちゃいます。Put it. When you're putting shot after shot, a lot of people start to lose consistency little by little. A common thing I hear is, my espresso tastes off, or the extraction seems inconsistent. And when that happens, people start blaming the machine. But honestly, I think before blaming the gear, we should take a look at the barista's own movements. Like, Maybe you didn't wipe the basket thoroughly, or your distribution was a little rushed, or maybe you were too rough when locking it into the group head. All those little slips in technique add up, and they show up in the taste. So no matter how busy it gets, it's really important to go through each step with care and precision. To me, strong baristas aren't just fast. They're the ones who can stay consistent, move with good speed, and still keep the quality high every single time. When you're tasting espresso, always make sure to give it a good stir before you take a sip. That's because the flavor of espresso changes throughout the shot. The first part tends to be more concentrated, and the later part comes out lighter. So if you drink it without mixing, your first sip might taste way too strong, or maybe even too weak. It ends up feeling unbalanced. In other words, if you don't stir it, you won't really get the full picture of what that espresso is supposed to taste like. And sometimes you'll see people slurping espresso like they're doing a cupping, making that sound. I don't really recommend that. Here's why. Espresso has a layer of crema on top, and the actual liquid sits underneath. When you slurp, you usually just end up tasting the crema, not the whole shot. That throws off the balance too. With cupping coffee, it's just one uniform liquid, so slurping works fine to get the flavor. But espresso has a different structure, so you've got to approach it a little differently. So yeah, when you're tasting espresso, give it a good stir first, then take a slow, normal sip. That's the best way to really understand the flavor. When it comes to making great espresso, there's something super important I want to say. Good espresso only comes from clean movements and a clean espresso machine. For example, if your basket or shower screen is dirty, that mess is going to show up in the flavor. You might get extra bitterness or just an off taste. That's why everything matters. Not just your technique, but also how clean your tools and machine are. Doing everything with care and keeping things clean really makes a big difference. Also, when you understand what each step actually means and why you're doing it, your espresso starts to taste better and better. I think this video covers lots of the basics you need to know about making espresso, so I hope you'll come back to it and watch it a few times. It'll really help you make the ideas stick. And if there's anything you're not sure about, feel free to leave a comment, or you can look it up yourself too. I'd be happy to break it down and explain it for you. Alright. First, I take out the portafilter. Then I give it a rinse and quickly clean both the shower screen and the basket. If I let the basket drip a little over the drip tray first, it makes it easier to wipe dry. So I go ahead and wipe both the inside and the outside of the basket. Next, I place the portafilter on the scale and zero it out before grinding. Okay. Once it's done grinding, I check the weight, and if it's a bit short, I just add a little more coffee. Before using the distribution tool, I start by gently leveling the grounds with my hand. Then I use the tool to flatten everything nice and evenly. If I'm using the Puqpress, I always make sure to wipe the tamper head first before placing the portafilter in. If I'm tamping by hand, I press down firmly from the spot where I feel the strongest and most stable. Then I give the drip tray a quick wipe, gently lock in the portafilter, and start the shot right away. During extraction, what I usually look at is how many seconds it takes for the first drop to appear and whether there's any channeling happening. As the shot goes on, you'll notice the color of the espresso gradually changes. It starts off dark brown and then shifts to a lighter, more yellowish tone. And that's the whole flow of pulling an espresso shot. So, before we wrap up, I just want to leave you with a quick message. I'm guessing some of you watching this are either thinking about becoming a barista or have just started. Here's what I really want to say. If there's something you don't know or understand, ask about it right then and there. If you pretend to know what you're doing, people around you might assume you got it all figured out. Later on, when it turns out you didn't, it can get pretty awkward. So asking questions in the moment is super important. Saying something like, "Hey, what should I do here?" or "Could you show me how to do this?" is way better. Even for me, I don't know the recipes for every cafe out there. So honestly, not knowing something isn't a bad thing at all. And there's nothing to be embarrassed about. The worst thing you can do is stay quiet and stay confused. When you ask questions, you learn faster. It really helps you grow. And that's a big part of getting better. I'll keep posting more videos like this, so if you felt like you learned something or enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate it if you gave it a like and subscribed. That's it for this espresso routine episode of Yuki's Coffee University. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.